The woman felt something strange in her stomach. The doctors had never seen anything like it. Hello, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment on what you think is going to happen, and let's see if you get it right. Write your prediction below, and at the end, I'll give you the answer. The early morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows on the bedroom walls. Emily had always been a morning person, relishing the quiet moments before the world woke up. But today was different. As she sat up in bed, she felt a strange sensation in her abdomen, something she couldn't quite explain. It wasn't pain exactly, but a deep discomfort that gnawed at her, unlike anything she'd ever experienced. She pressed her hands gently against her stomach, hoping the feeling would subside, but it didn't. With a furrowed brow, Emily stood up, trying to shake off the unease. After all, it could be nothing. Just a bad meal from last night, she reasoned. Still, a nagging voice in the back of her mind told her this was something more. As the hours passed, the sensation grew stronger, a strange fluttering deep within her. Emily found herself pacing back and forth across the living room, her hands trembling slightly. She tried to go about her normal routine, making coffee, reading the morning news, but her mind kept drifting back to that strange feeling. What could it be? She wasn't pregnant. That much she knew. Besides, this didn't feel like the kind of discomfort she had read about in pregnancy books. It felt otherworldly. Shaking her head, she dismissed the thought. "I'm being ridiculous," she muttered to herself. But deep down, Emily couldn't shake the sense that something inside her was changing, something that defied explanation. By the time afternoon arrived, the unease had become impossible to ignore. Emily finally called her doctor, hoping for some reassurance. "I've been feeling strange," she said, struggling to find the right words. "It's hard to explain, but it's in my stomach like a fluttering or... I don't know. It's just not right." The receptionist booked her in for a checkup the next day, but even as Emily hung up the phone, she knew she couldn't wait that long. Her gut told her something was seriously wrong. Desperation began to creep in, her mind racing through all the possibilities. An undiagnosed illness, something she hadn't anticipated. But even those logical explanations seemed too simple for what she was feeling. As evening descended, Emily's worry grew into full-blown panic. She tried to sleep, but the sensation only intensified in the quiet darkness of her room. It was as if something inside her was moving, shifting, alive in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Heart pounding, she grabbed her keys and headed to the hospital. She didn't care how irrational she might seem. Something was wrong, and she needed answers. As she drove through the quiet streets, a sense of dread washed over her. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just in her head. The doctors would have to see it too. Surely they would know what to do. Or at least that's what she hoped. Emily arrived at the hospital, her heart racing as she parked the car. The sterile lights of the emergency room loomed ahead, casting an eerie glow on the pavement. As she stepped inside, the usual hum of activity, nurses scurrying, patients waiting, seemed muted by the pounding in her chest. Approaching the front desk, she struggled to explain the strange sensation. "It's my stomach," she stammered. "There's something wrong. I can't explain it, but I need to see someone right away." The receptionist, noting the urgency in Emily's voice, quickly arranged for a doctor. Within minutes, she was ushered into a small examination room, the sterile smell of disinfectant filling her senses. Dr. Harris, a seasoned physician with a calm demeanor, entered the room, clipboard in hand. He listened attentively as Emily described the sensation, how it started as a flutter and had grown into something far more unsettling. "I've never felt anything like this before," Emily emphasized, her voice shaky. Dr. Harris nodded, his face expressionless as he ordered a series of tests. "We'll run some blood work and perform an ultrasound to get a better understanding," he said, trying to reassure her. Yet, as the nurses prepped her for the scans, Emily's anxiety only deepened. What if they didn't find anything? What if this strange feeling was beyond the scope of modern medicine? The ultrasound technician moved the probe across Emily's abdomen, eyes focused intently on the screen. For a few moments, everything seemed routine. But then the technician's brow furrowed. "That's odd," she muttered under her breath. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What is it? What's odd?" she asked, her voice rising with panic. The technician didn't respond immediately, instead calling Dr. Harris back into the room. "There's something here, but I can't quite make sense of it," she explained, pointing to the screen. Dr. Harris squinted at the monitor, his calm facade beginning to crack ever so slightly. "It's not a tumor, and it doesn't appear to be a normal mass. We're going to need more detailed imaging." Emily's mind raced as they wheeled her down the hallway for an MRI. Her thoughts spiraled. What could be inside her? Was it alive? The feeling in her stomach had intensified, and now, with the doctor's confusion, her fear turned to terror. The MRI machine hummed loudly as she lay still, trapped in a tunnel of uncertainty. As the scan progressed, her mind flashed through all the worst-case scenarios: parasites, mutations, unknown diseases. But as the machine clicked to a stop and she was wheeled back to her room, none of those fears compared to what Dr. Harris was about to reveal. The doctors, normally so composed, were expressions of disbelief. "Emily," Dr. Harris said slowly, "what we're seeing, it's unlike anything we've ever encountered. We need to call in a specialist." As Emily sat in the hospital bed, her mind a blur of fear and confusion, Dr. Harris left the room to consult with a specialist. The sterile surroundings did little to comfort her growing dread. The rhythmic beeping of the machines felt almost mocking in their normalcy. How could everything seem so routine when she felt anything but? She stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what the doctors had told her so far. "Unlike anything we've ever encountered," those words echoed in her mind, stirring up thoughts of every medical anomaly she had ever heard about. Was she about to become another bizarre case, the subject of medical journals and documentaries? Minutes felt like hours as Emily waited, the strange sensation in her stomach now pulsating with every beat of her heart. It wasn't pain, it was something else entirely. She couldn't escape the feeling that whatever was inside her was aware, conscious in some way. She placed her hands over her stomach, almost as if trying to communicate with it, to understand what was happening beneath her skin. But there was no response, just that steady, unsettling movement. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside her door. Dr. Harris re-entered, this time accompanied by a man in a white lab coat, his expression serious. "This is Dr. Callahan," Dr. Harris introduced the newcomer. "He's a specialist in rare conditions and medical anomalies. We've consulted with him, and he's agreed to take a closer look at your case." Dr. Callahan nodded politely, but his eyes were focused, studying Emily as though she were a puzzle to be solved. "I've reviewed the scans," he said in a deep, methodical voice. "What we're seeing here is, well, it defies conventional medical understanding. There's something growing inside you, but it's not a typical mass. It's organic, yet it doesn't behave like any known tissue or parasite." Emily's heart sank. The doctors had confirmed her worst fears. They had no idea what was happening to her. Dr. Callahan wasted no time. "We're going to run a few more tests," he explained. "But I want you to prepare for the possibility that this will take time. Whatever this is, it's not something we've seen before, and we'll need to proceed cautiously." His words offered little comfort. Emily nodded numbly as the medical team began preparations for another round of invasive procedures. As they drew blood and scanned her body once more, she could only lie there, helpless, wondering what kind of nightmare she had stumbled into. She thought of calling her family, but how could she explain something that even the doctors couldn't understand? As the evening drew on, Emily felt more isolated than ever. Dr. Callahan and his team were working tirelessly, but their progress seemed slow. Every time they returned with updates, it was always the same: more confusion, more uncertainty. Whatever was inside her was growing. That much they knew, but its purpose, its nature, remained a mystery. Emily's mind churned with questions she couldn't voice. Was this some kind of new life form? A mutation? Or was it something far worse, something that shouldn't exist? The thought gnawed at her as she tried to sleep that night, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her mind too frantic for rest. Somewhere deep inside, the strange presence continued to stir, waiting, growing. The following morning, the hospital buzzed with a quiet tension. Emily lay awake, her body numb from the endless prodding and scanning, but her mind was wide open, racing with terrifying possibilities. She overheard the nurses whispering outside her room. Words like unprecedented, unexplainable, and abnormal floated through the air, making her stomach turn even more than the strange sensation within. Every part of her wanted to escape, but there was no escaping her own body. She was trapped in a mystery that was rapidly consuming her. What had once been a strange flutter had now grown into something more tangible, more powerful, almost as if the presence inside her was trying to make itself known. Dr. Callahan returned in the late morning, looking more solemn than ever. "Emily," he began, pulling a chair beside her bed. "We've reviewed the latest results, and I wish I had more concrete answers for you. But right now, we're still working in the dark. The growth inside you doesn't match anything we've encountered. It's not a tumor, not a cyst. It's living tissue, but it's not forming in any known pattern." Emily stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Living tissue?" she whispered. Is it dangerous?" Dr. Callahan paused, considering his words carefully. "At this point, we don't know. But we need to monitor you closely. This could be something new, something unprecedented." As the day wore on, the sensation in Emily's abdomen became more pronounced. No longer just a vague fluttering, but a distinct, almost rhythmic movement. It felt as if something, or someone, was trying to communicate with her from the inside. She tried to shake off the thought, dismissing it as absurd, but every time the movement intensified, the fear gripped her more tightly. By mid-afternoon, the unease had grown into full-blown panic. "I need answers," Emily finally demanded, her voice trembling with fear. "I can't just sit here and wait while this thing grows inside me. What if it's something that's going to kill me?" The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. Dr. Callahan exchanged a glance with Dr. Harris, who had just entered the room. "Emily, we understand your fear," Dr. Harris said gently, "but we have to proceed with caution. We're consulting with experts from around the world, trying to piece together what this could be. We don't want to jump to conclusions before we have all the facts." But Emily wasn't comforted. She could feel the doctor's uncertainty, the unspoken terror lurking behind their professional facades. They didn't know what was happening any more than she did, and that scared her more than any diagnosis could. As evening approached, Emily felt more isolated than ever. The hospital staff moved in and out of her room, performing routine checks, but no one had any real answers. The strange movements inside her continued, rhythmic, deliberate, as if the presence was growing stronger by the hour. She placed her hands over her stomach, feeling the subtle shift of the unknown entity beneath her skin. What was it? A part of her was beginning to suspect that this was no ordinary medical mystery. This was something much bigger, something beyond science. The fear was relentless, gnawing at her with every movement of the thing inside. She lay in the dark, eyes wide open, listening to the steady rhythm from within, terrified of what the morning would bring. Morning arrived, but the comfort of daylight did little to ease Emily's fears. As the sun crept through the hospital blinds, she could feel the strange presence in her abdomen growing stronger. The movements, once subtle and unsettling, had now become pronounced, almost purposeful. It was as if the entity inside her was responding to her anxiety, reacting to the very emotions she couldn't contain. She placed her hands over her stomach again, hoping for some sign that this was all just a horrible dream. But the sensation was real, disturbingly real, and Emily knew that something unimaginable was taking place within her. Dr. Callahan entered the room with a clipboard, his expression more serious than the day before. "Emily," he began, sitting down beside her bed, "we've received feedback from several specialists around the world. None of them have seen anything like this. But what's more concerning is that the growth inside you is developing at an accelerated rate. Whatever this is, it's evolving faster than we expected." His words were like a punch to her gut. The room seemed to spin as she tried to process what he was saying. "Evolving?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "What does that even mean? What's happening to me?" Dr. Callahan exhaled slowly, clearly trying to maintain his composure. "We're not certain, but it seems that whatever is inside you isn't just growing. It's adapting, changing in ways that defy medical logic. We're going to run another round of tests, but I want you to understand something. This is beyond anything we've ever seen in modern medicine. We're dealing with something entirely new, and we need to be prepared for any outcome." His words hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating Emily with the weight of the unknown. She could hear the urgency in his voice, the unspoken fear that even the doctors were struggling to keep at bay. As the nurses wheeled her down to the imaging department for yet another round of scans, Emily's mind raced. She felt trapped, like a prisoner in her own body. The movements in her stomach had become more insistent, more deliberate, almost as if the presence was trying to communicate with her. It wasn't painful, but it was deeply unsettling, like a heartbeat that wasn't hers, an alien rhythm pulsing beneath her skin. As she lay in the cold, sterile room, the MRI machine whirring around her, she closed her eyes, trying to focus on her breathing. But even that felt unnatural now, as though her body was no longer entirely her own. When the scans were complete, Emily was wheeled back to her room, but she noticed that the hospital staff seemed more on edge than usual. Dr. Callahan and Dr. Harris returned to her bedside, their faces grim. "Emily," Dr. Harris began, choosing his words carefully, "the scans show something unprecedented. The growth inside you, it's no longer just a mass. It's forming structures, biological features that resemble, well, we're not entirely sure, but it appears to be creating something new, something we can't yet classify." His voice faltered slightly, as if he himself couldn't fully believe what he was saying. Emily's heart raced as the full weight of his words sank in. She was no longer just a medical mystery. She was the host of something unexplainable, something that defied all logic. The presence inside her wasn't just growing, it was becoming something. And with every passing moment, she could feel it awakening, as if it was preparing for a purpose beyond her comprehension. The fear in her chest tightened into something more primal. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just a medical anomaly. It was the start of something far more terrifying. The hospital room seemed to shrink around Emily, the walls closing in as the reality of her situation became clearer. The words "something new" echoed in her mind, refusing to let her rest. She wasn't just sick, she was transforming into something entirely unknown, and with every moment, the presence inside her was growing, evolving. She tried to push the thought away, but the constant movement in her abdomen reminded her that whatever was happening was far from over. Every flutter, every pulse, felt more deliberate, more alive, as if the entity inside her was gaining strength with each passing second. The doctors had become more secretive. Nurses no longer made small talk. Instead, they hurried in and out of her room with quick, nervous glances, exchanging words in hushed tones. Emily could feel their unease, as if it were her own. She could sense the gravity of what was happening, even if no one dared to say it out loud. She caught glimpses of her charts, filled with terms she didn't understand, and overheard fragments of conversations about biological anomalies and unprecedented growth rates. Each day brought new tests, new scans, but no one had any real answers. The silence from the medical team spoke louder than any diagnosis ever could. Dr. Callahan, who had been leading her case, seemed particularly strained. He had stopped giving her reassurances and now only spoke in facts. "Emily, we're seeing further development in the structures inside you," he explained during his most recent visit. "It's still too early to fully understand what's happening, but the growth is no longer just an irregular mass. It appears to be forming into something with intent, but we don't yet know what that intent is." His voice was calm, measured, but the worry etched in his face betrayed him. "We're bringing in specialists from multiple disciplines: genetics, evolutionary biology, even bioengineering. We need every expert we can get." The gravity of his words sank in like a lead weight. Specialists from around the world were being consulted, and yet no one could tell her what was happening. Emily's fear had morphed into something darker, a gnawing sense of dread that seemed to grow in tandem with the presence inside her. She had always been a rational person, but this situation defied all logic. She wasn't just a patient anymore. She was a case study, an anomaly, a living experiment. And worst of all, she had no control over what was happening to her own body. The feeling of helplessness was unbearable. That night, the presence inside her felt stronger than ever. It was no longer just an unsettling sensation. It was a force, a pulse of energy that radiated through her entire body. She lay in bed, her hands resting on her abdomen, feeling the rhythmic movements deep within her. Her heart raced as she realized that the presence was no longer passive. It was responding to her. Every time she shifted in bed, every time her heart quickened with fear, the entity inside her reacted, almost as if it could sense her emotions. The thought chilled her to the bone. She wasn't just a host to something growing. She was connected to it in a way that she couldn't explain. And with every passing moment, that connection seemed to grow stronger. As the hospital fell silent for the night, Emily's mind raced. What was happening to her? What was the entity inside her becoming? And most terrifying of all, what would happen when it finally reached its full form? She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the thoughts, but the rhythmic pulse inside her abdomen kept her awake, reminding her that the answers were coming, whether she was ready for them or not. Morning light filtered through the blinds, but Emily didn't feel the usual sense of relief that came with the dawn. Instead, a sense of foreboding loomed over her, heavier than ever. The presence inside her was no longer just a strange sensation. It felt alive, sentient, aware of her every movement and emotion. She sat up slowly, her hand instinctively resting on her abdomen, feeling the familiar but terrifying rhythmic pulse. Whatever was growing inside her was no longer content with being dormant. It was evolving, and she could feel its urgency, as if it was preparing for something. Dr. Callahan entered her room, looking more exhausted than before. "Emily," he began, his voice heavy with concern, "we've been monitoring the growth closely, and there's something you need to know. The structures forming inside you are not just biological anomalies. They're showing signs of organization, patterns that suggest an intelligence, a purpose." His words sent a chill through her. "Intelligence?" she echoed, her voice trembling. "What does that even mean?" Dr. Callahan hesitated before speaking, his brow furrowed in deep thought. "We don't fully understand it yet, but the patterns we're seeing suggest that this is not just random growth. It's as if the presence inside you is aware." Emily's heart raced, her mind struggling to comprehend what he was saying. Aware? The idea that something inside her was conscious, intelligent, made her feel utterly powerless. She had thought of herself as a medical anomaly, but now she realized she was something far more terrifying. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Callahan looked at her gravely. "We've brought in a team of experts from various fields. We're running advanced tests, scans we've never used before. But the truth is, we don't know what's going to happen next. We're venturing into completely uncharted territory." The day passed in a blur of tests, but Emily could barely focus on the medical procedures anymore. Her mind kept returning to one question. What was this entity inside her? It wasn't just an unknown growth. It had a purpose, a will. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. The rhythmic pulse inside her abdomen was growing stronger, more insistent. It was as if the entity was trying to communicate with her, but in a way she couldn't understand. The sensation had evolved from a mere flutter to something much more pronounced, almost as if it was preparing for its next phase. By late afternoon, Emily was exhausted, both physically and mentally. She had drifted in and out of restless sleep, haunted by dreams of strange, shadowy figures and foreign landscapes. Every time she woke, the pulse in her abdomen seemed to grow stronger, more synchronized with her own heartbeat. She stared at the ceiling, trying to calm her racing thoughts, but it was no use. The entity inside her was becoming more powerful, more present. And with every passing hour, she felt less in control. As night fell, the hospital seemed eerily quiet. Dr. Callahan and his team had retreated to their labs, analyzing the latest results. Emily lay in the dark, her hand on her stomach, feeling the steady movements within her. She didn't need the doctors to tell her what was happening. She could feel it. The entity inside her wasn't just growing. It was getting ready for something. Her body was no longer just a vessel. It was part of a larger process, something beyond her comprehension. And as the hours ticked by, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that soon, very soon, the entity would reveal its true purpose. She closed her eyes, trying to brace herself for what was to come, knowing that whatever it was, her life would never be the same again. Emily woke with a start, the rhythmic pulsing inside her now undeniable, almost overpowering. She could feel it, moving in sync with her body, more than just a foreign presence. It was alive in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. The sun hadn't yet risen, but the hospital was already beginning to stir. She could hear the distant murmur of doctors and nurses outside her room, their voices low and tense. They were waiting, just like she was, for whatever was inside her to reveal itself. And Emily had the unnerving sense that the moment was fast approaching. Dr. Callahan arrived early, flanked by a small team of specialists. Their faces were grave, marked with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "Emily," Dr. Callahan began, sitting beside her bed, "we've been monitoring the growth overnight. The scans show that it's reached a critical point. Something's going to happen soon. We don't know exactly what, but we need to be prepared for any eventuality." His words felt like a countdown, each one amplifying the fear that had gripped her heart. "What do you mean, something's going to happen?" she asked, her voice barely steady. Dr. Callahan exchanged a look with the specialists. "It's developing faster than we anticipated. Whatever is inside you, it's no longer passive. It's becoming something." The room seemed to close in around her, the sterile walls no longer a place of safety, but a trap, holding her captive to the mystery within. Emily tried to steady her breathing, but every inhale brought a new wave of fear. The movements inside her had grown stronger, more coordinated. It was as though the entity was preparing itself, organizing, waiting for the perfect moment to act. The idea that it had a will of its own, that it was actively responding to her, terrified her to the core. As the doctors began another round of scans, Emily's mind raced. What was happening to her? What was this thing inside her becoming? She watched as the specialists moved quickly, their faces tight with concentration, speaking in low tones as they analyzed the data in real time. Every glance they exchanged sent chills down her spine. They didn't know what was happening any more than she did. The uncertainty was suffocating. The minutes passed like hours. The room was filled with the soft hum of machines, the steady beep of monitors tracking her vitals, but Emily's mind was elsewhere. She could feel the entity growing stronger, pushing against the boundaries of her body. She wasn't just an observer anymore. She was part of whatever was happening. Her pulse quickened as the realization hit her. The entity wasn't just evolving, it was using her, drawing on her strength, her life force, to complete its transformation. Suddenly, one of the machines beeped loudly, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Dr. Callahan rushed to the monitor, his face going pale as he read the data. "It's happening," he muttered, barely loud enough for Emily to hear. "Emily, we need to prepare for an immediate intervention. Whatever is inside you, it's reaching its final stage. We have to be ready for anything." Panic flooded her as the words sank in. The final stage. What did that mean? What was going to happen to her? As the medical team scrambled into action, Emily felt a sudden, intense pressure in her abdomen, followed by a sharp electric jolt that surged through her body. She gasped, clutching her stomach as the entity inside her responded in kind, its movements no longer gentle but forceful, deliberate. It was ready. Emily's eyes widened in terror as she realized the truth. This wasn't just a medical anomaly. This was something far beyond human understanding. And in that moment, as the pressure built to an unbearable level, she knew whatever was inside her was about to emerge. The pressure inside Emily's abdomen became unbearable, as if her body was being pushed to its limits, stretched beyond what it could endure. The hospital room was a blur of activity, doctors and nurses rushing in with machines, equipment, and medications. Emily gripped the sides of her bed, her knuckles white, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Her entire body was trembling, and it felt as though the entity inside her was no longer just responding. It was in control. Every pulse, every movement was deliberate, purposeful, and terrifyingly strong. Whatever was inside her was no longer just growing. It was ready to break free. Dr. Callahan was at her side, his face a mask of calm professionalism, but Emily could see the fear in his eyes. "Emily, we need to act now," he said firmly, though his voice carried a hint of urgency. "We're going to perform an emergency procedure to extract whatever is inside you. We don't know what we're dealing with, but we can't wait any longer." Emily nodded weakly, unable to speak as another wave of pressure surged through her body, leaving her gasping for air. She could feel it. The entity was on the verge of breaking through, and it wasn't going to wait for anyone's permission. The medical team prepared for the procedure, the room buzzing with tension. But before they could begin, something happened that no one could have anticipated. Emily's body jerked violently, her back arching off the bed as a sharp, searing pain shot through her abdomen. Her vision blurred, and the room seemed to spin. The presence inside her wasn't waiting any longer. It was emerging, whether the doctors were ready or not. A strangled cry escaped her lips as the pressure reached its peak, and in that instant, she felt something shift, something break free. The monitors attached to Emily began to beep wildly, alarms blaring as her vital signs fluctuated. The doctors sprang into action, but it was too late. The entity inside her had taken over, and Emily could feel it. Feel the strange, alien force surging through her veins, taking control of her body in ways she couldn't explain. Her mind was a haze of fear and confusion, but deep inside, she knew this was the moment she had dreaded since the first strange flutter in her stomach. With a sudden, overwhelming force, Emily felt the presence inside her push through. Her abdomen contracted violently, and she could feel the entity moving, shifting, as if it was detaching itself from her. The pain was indescribable, a mix of fire and electricity coursing through her entire body. She screamed, her hands clutching her stomach as the entity finally broke free. The room fell silent as the doctors stared in shock. There, in the sterile hospital light, something new had emerged from Emily's body, something that defied explanation. It wasn't human, not entirely. The doctors stood frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief, as the entity moved, its form shimmering and shifting like nothing they had ever seen before. It was small, barely the size of a newborn, but its presence was overwhelming, filling the room with an almost palpable energy. Emily's vision blurred as she struggled to comprehend what had just happened, her body weak and trembling from the ordeal. Dr. Callahan was the first to break the stunned silence, his voice shaking as he spoke. What is that?" he whispered, his eyes fixed on the strange being that had just emerged from Emily's body. The medical team moved cautiously, unsure of how to proceed, but no one dared get too close. The entity, for its part, seemed to pulse with life, its form shifting and changing with every passing second. It was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. A new life, born from something beyond human comprehension. Emily lay back on the bed, her body exhausted, her mind reeling from what she had just experienced. The entity, whatever it was, had finally emerged. But what it was, and what it meant for her, remained a terrifying mystery. The room was steeped in an eerie, stunned silence as the entity hovered in the air, shimmering and shifting with an energy none of the medical team could comprehend. Emily, weakened and barely conscious, lay still on the hospital bed, her eyes fluttering open to take in the impossible sight. The being that had emerged from her was unlike anything she had ever imagined. Fluid, ethereal, yet disturbingly tangible. Dr. Callahan and the other doctors stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Fear rippled through the room, paralyzing them. Dr. Harris, who had maintained his composure throughout the ordeal, was the first to take a tentative step forward. "We need to contain this, whatever it is," he murmured, his voice cracking under the weight of the unknown. The entity, seemingly unbothered by their presence, pulsed gently, as if testing the air around it. It didn't appear hostile, but there was an overwhelming sense of power radiating from it, a power that no one in the room could ignore. The doctors exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to do next. Emily, her body still weak from the trauma of the emergence, found herself barely able to move. Her mind, however, was racing. The connection she had felt with the entity inside her was still there, a thin but unmistakable thread that bound her to whatever it was that had emerged. She could sense its presence, not just in the room, but within her, as though some part of it had stayed behind. It was a terrifying realization, but at the same time, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace, an understanding that she was no longer just herself. She was connected to something far greater. As the minutes passed, the entity began to change, its form becoming more defined, more solid. The doctors, finally breaking from their paralysis, began to scramble for containment equipment, but it was too late. The entity, sensing their movements, shifted again, this time in a flash of light that caused everyone in the room to shield their eyes. When the light faded, the entity was gone. The room fell into chaos as the medical team tried to comprehend what had just occurred. Emily, still lying on the bed, knew one thing for sure. This was far from over. For hours after the entity vanished, the hospital remained in a state of shock. Security teams were called in, specialists from across the country were alerted, and containment protocols were put in place. But none of it seemed to matter. The entity had simply disappeared, leaving no trace of its existence, except for the scans and the memories of those who had witnessed it. The medical team tried to focus on Emily, running tests to see if she had sustained any further damage from the emergence. But as the tests came back, one thing became clear. Physically, Emily was fine. No internal injuries, no lasting damage from the strange presence that had once been inside her. Yet something had changed. Emily could feel it, deep in her core. The connection to the entity wasn't gone. It was just different. It was as if it had left something behind inside her, a piece of itself that still pulsed within her veins. She didn't know what it meant, but she could sense it growing, evolving, just as the entity had before. The doctors, unaware of the internal transformation, were focused on understanding the anomaly that had just unfolded. But Emily knew the truth. This was only the beginning. The authorities, desperate to contain the situation, began interviewing everyone who had been in the room when the entity emerged. They gathered data, reviewed scans, and consulted with experts, but no one could provide a clear answer. What was it? Where had it gone? And most pressing of all, would it return? Dr. Callahan, visibly shaken by the events, struggled to maintain his usual professional demeanor as he updated Emily on their findings, or lack thereof. "We don't know what it was," he admitted, his voice barely steady. "And we don't know if it's coming back. But you need to understand, Emily, you're not just a patient anymore. You're part of this now, and whatever that thing was, it may still be connected to you." Emily stared at him, the weight of his words settling on her like a lead blanket. She had already known this, of course. She had felt the connection long before anyone else did. But now that the entity was gone, she couldn't help but feel the fear creeping back in. What had it left behind? And more importantly, what would happen next? Days passed, and life at the hospital slowly returned to a fragile sense of normalcy. The medical team, though still baffled by what had occurred, resumed their routines, but the tension was palpable. Emily remained under observation, though the doctors could find nothing physically wrong with her. Dr. Callahan insisted on keeping her for further tests, worried that the entity's departure had left unknown effects on her body. But Emily, deep down, knew the truth. The entity hadn't left her. It was still there, inside her, waiting. Late one evening, as Emily lay in her hospital bed, she felt it again, a faint pulse, not from her own heartbeat, but from something else. The connection was still there, growing stronger each day, becoming more pronounced. She placed her hands on her stomach, feeling the warmth beneath her skin. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The entity hadn't fully left her. It had planted something within her, something that was now waking up. Emily tried to keep calm, but the sensation was overwhelming. It wasn't painful, not like before, but it was undeniably powerful. She could feel the energy coursing through her, as if the entity had left behind a part of its consciousness, a part of its will. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding as the realization hit her. The entity hadn't just emerged from her. It had transformed her. Whatever had happened, she wasn't the same anymore. She was no longer just Emily. The door to her room opened, and Dr. Callahan stepped in, holding a clipboard. He began to speak, but stopped abruptly when he saw the look on her face. "Emily, are you all right?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. But Emily didn't answer. She couldn't. She was too consumed by the energy inside her, the awakening of something new, something powerful. She looked up at Dr. Callahan, her eyes wide with realization. "It's not over," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's just beginning." If you enjoyed this story and want to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And now, there's a new video appearing on the screen, full of unexpected twists and touching moments. Click and get ready for another inspiring story.